The bullet missed Tessa Granger's head by 3 inches, and instead of screaming, she fired back twice before her horse even finished rearing. 2 months of tracking the Dawson gang through California's Goldfield territory had led to this ambush on the road outside Placerville. And Tessa wasn't about to let some 2-bit outlaws collect the bounty they'd put on her head for testifying against their leader's brother. She rode hard toward the rocky outcropping where the shots had originated, her chestnut mare responding to every shift of her weight as naturally as breathing. When she reached the rocks, she found only spent shell casings and hoofprints heading north. They'd learned soon enough that intimidating Tessa Granger was like trying to rope the wind. By the time she rode back into Placerville that September afternoon in 1878, the sun hung low over the Sierra Nevada foothills, painting everything gold and amber. Tessa's father had been one of the 49ers who'd struck it rich here nearly 30 years ago, but he died when she was 16, leaving her his ranch, his rifle, and his stubborn insistence on doing what was right regardless of who it inconvenienced. Her mother had passed giving birth to her, so Tessa had grown up with cowhands and miners as her teachers, learning to rope cattle, break horses, and shoot straighter than most men twice her age. She dismounted outside the general store, her split riding skirt drawing the usual disapproving glances from Mrs. Henderson and her circle of friends. Tessa had stopped caring what they thought around the same time they'd started their campaign to find her a husband. She was 23 now, owned her ranch outright, employed 6 men who respected her judgment, and had no intention of handing over everything she'd built to some man just because society said a woman alone was improper. "Miss Granger, you really should consider proper attire, Mrs. Henderson called out, her voice dripping with false concern. "No wonder you cannot secure a husband when you go about dressed like a ranch hand." Tessa tied her horse's reins to the post and turned to face the older woman. "Mrs. Henderson, I was just shot at on the North Road. My attire was the least of my concerns, and finding a husband ranks somewhere below fixing my barn roof and rotating my cattle pastures." "Shot at." This came from a voice Tessa didn't recognize, deep and measured with a slight drawl that spoke of Texas or maybe Oklahoma. She turned to see a man stepping out of the general store, and despite her determination to remain unimpressed, she couldn't help but notice how he carried himself. He was tall, probably 30 or 31, with dark brown hair that needed cutting and eyes that assessed her with the careful attention of someone who actually saw what he was looking at, rather than what he expected to see. He wore simple work clothes, a worn gun belt, and carried himself like a man who'd spent more time working than talking about it. "The Dawson gang has decided I'm a problem worth solving," Tessa said, meeting his gaze directly. Most men either looked away first or stared with challenge. He did neither, just listened with genuine concern. "I testified against Cole Dawson for rustling cattle from my ranch and 3 others. His brother Ray didn't take kindly to it. Ray Dawson is running with 4 other men, all of them mean as rattlesnakes and twice as quick," the stranger said. "You rode away from an ambush by yourself. I didn't have much choice in the matter. They chose the location, not me. Besides, I can handle myself just fine." Mrs. Henderson made a disapproving sound. "This is precisely the problem, Mr. Irving. Miss Granger has no sense of proper female behavior. She runs that ranch like a man, dresses inappropriately, and refuses every suitable match we've proposed. She's too independent for marriage, I'm afraid. No man wants a wife who thinks she doesn't need him." The stranger, Mr. Irving apparently, tilted his head slightly. "Madam, with all due respect, seems to me the problem isn't that Miss Granger is too independent. The problem is you've been introducing her to the wrong kind of men. He turned back to Tessa. I'm Mason Irving. Just rode in 3 days ago. I'm looking to establish a horse breeding operation, and I heard you might have some land for lease and know the territory well enough to tell me what I'm getting into. Tessa studied him more carefully now. Horse breeding required patience, knowledge, and the kind of long-term thinking that most men passing through gold country didn't possess. The Granger Ranch is 5 miles east of town. My foreman, Jack Sullivan, can tell you about the lease parcels. But I'll warn you now, Mr. Irving, this territory isn't as friendly as it once was. The gold's running thin, which makes men desperate. Rustlers, claim jumpers, and people like the Dawson gang are becoming more common. Which is exactly why I'm not looking to work alone, Mason said. I need a partner who knows the land, knows the people, and has the strength to help build something that'll last. From what I've heard since arriving, you might be the only person in this town who fits that description. Mrs. Henderson gasped audibly. Mr. Irving, surely you cannot be suggesting a business partnership with an unmarried woman. The impropriety alone would be scandalous. I'm suggesting exactly that, madam, Mason replied without looking away from Tessa. I've worked ranches from Texas to Montana, and the best partnerships I've seen were based on skill and character, not gender. Miss Granger runs a successful operation. That takes intelligence and determination. Those are the qualities I need in a partner. Tessa felt something shift in her chest, an unexpected flutter of surprise mixed with something else she couldn't quite name. Men had proposed business to her father's legacy before, always with the underlying assumption that they'd take over while she faded into a domestic role. Mason Irving was the first to speak to her as an equal with something valuable to offer. Come out to the ranch tomorrow morning, she said. We can discuss terms. But I'll warn you now, Mr. Irving, I don't sign anything without understanding every detail, and I don't make partnerships based on charm or smooth talking. For the first time, Mason smiled, and it transformed his serious face into something warmer. Good. I don't trust people who make decisions too quick. 9 o'clock work for you. I'll have coffee ready, Tessa said, then turned back to Mrs. Henderson. And you can tell the town gossips that if Mason Irving and I do form a partnership, it'll be based on business sense, not their narrow ideas about what a woman should or shouldn't do. She bought her supplies, loaded them onto her horse, and rode out of town with her head high, but she couldn't stop thinking about the way Mason Irving had looked at her. Not with the dismissive condescension she'd grown accustomed to, nor with the uncomfortable hunger some men showed when they thought a woman alone must be desperate for male attention. He'd looked at her like she was a puzzle worth solving, a person worth knowing, and that was more intriguing than Tessa wanted to admit. The next morning dawned clear and cool, the autumn air carrying the scent of dry grass and pine from the surrounding hills. Tessa had been up since before sunrise, checking on her cattle, reviewing her accounts, and trying to convince herself that her extra attention to her appearance had nothing to do with Mason Irving's visit. She'd still chosen her split riding skirt over a dress because practicality mattered more than impression. But she'd also braided her long dark hair more carefully than usual and made sure her shirt was clean. Jack Sullivan, her foreman and her father's old friend, had given her a knowing look over breakfast. At 56, with more gray than brown in his beard, Jack had been the closest thing to family Tessa had for the past 7 years. He'd taught her everything about running the ranch her father hadn't lived to pass on. "This Irving fellow, you checked him out?" Jack asked, pouring himself another cup of coffee. "Asked around yesterday after I got back," Tessa said. He worked for the Preston outfit up in Sacramento County for 2 years, helped them build one of the best breeding programs in Northern California. Before that, he was in Nevada working silver claims and learning horses from a Paiute man who'd married into the ranching family he was working for. People speak well of him, says he's honest, works harder than anyone, and has an eye for bloodlines that's almost uncanny. And he wants to partner with you. Says he needs someone who knows the territory and has the strength to build something lasting, Tessa said, then caught herself. His words, not mine. Jack smiled into his coffee. Strength. That's a good word for what you've got. Better than stubborn, which is what I usually call it. I learned from the best. Mason arrived precisely at 9 o'clock, riding a gray gelding that immediately caught Tessa's attention. The horse was built for endurance rather than speed, with clean lines and intelligent eyes. A man's choice of horse told you a lot about his priorities, and this one spoke of someone who valued reliability over flash. "That's good stock," Tessa said by way of greeting, walking down from the ranch house porch. Mason dismounted and ran a hand along the gelding's neck. "His name's Granite. Bought him off a rancher in Nevada who was going out of business. The man had bred him from a Mustang mare and a Morgan stallion, trying to combine the Mustang's hardiness with the Morgan's temperament. Took years to get the mix right, but this fellow here is proof it can work. That's the kind of breeding program I want to establish. Practical horses for working people, not fancy show stock that can't handle real ranch work." Tessa walked around the horse, assessing his conformation with the practiced eye her father had taught her to develop. Strong hindquarters, good bone structure, calm disposition. "You've thought this through." "I've spent 10 years thinking about nothing else," Mason said. "I've worked enough ranches and mining operations to see what kind of horses people actually need. Everyone's breeding for speed or size, but what folks really need are horses that can work all day, handle rough terrain, stay sound, and have the sense not to spook at every shadow. The right breeding program could supply horses to every ranch and mine from here to the Nevada border. And you need land, capital, and local knowledge to make it work," Tessa said. "That's where you come in. I've got some money saved, enough to buy good breeding stock and cover costs for the first year. What I don't have is land or connections in this area. You've got both, plus a reputation for running a tight operation. I propose we split the investment and the profits 60-40, with you getting the larger share since you're providing the land and the local expertise." Tessa raised her eyebrows. Most men in his position would have suggested they take the larger share, citing their expertise or their gender. "That's generous." "It's fair," Mason corrected. "You're taking the bigger risk. This is your land, your reputation. If I fail, I move on to the next opportunity. If you fail, you lose everything you've built. The split should reflect that reality." They spent the next 2 hours walking the ranch, discussing logistics, looking at possible pasture land for the breeding operation, and debating bloodlines. Tessa found herself increasingly impressed not just by Mason's knowledge, but by the way he listened to her input. When she suggested modifications to his breeding plans based on local conditions, he considered her points seriously and adjusted his thinking. When they disagreed about whether to focus on Morgan or Andalusian stallions for breeding, they debated the merits like colleagues, not adversaries. By the time they returned to the ranch house, Tessa had made her decision. "I'll agree to the partnership on 2 conditions. First, we draw up proper legal papers, everything documented and witnessed. I won't risk my ranch on a handshake and good intentions. Second, you work here on the ranch for 1 month before we finalize anything. I need to see how you handle yourself, how my men respond to you, and whether your knowledge translates to actual results." Mason extended his hand. Those are the same conditions I would have suggested if you hadn't. You have yourself a trial partnership, Miss Granger." His hand was calloused and warm, the grip firm without trying to prove anything. Tessa shook it, and for a moment their eyes met, and she felt that flutter again, stronger this time. She released his hand quickly, disturbed by her own reaction. She'd built her independence carefully, learning to rely on herself, to make decisions without needing approval or validation from anyone. The last thing she needed was to develop feelings for a business partner, especially one she'd just met. "You can take the cabin behind the main barn," she said, stepping back. "It's small but clean. Jack will introduce you to the ranch hands and show you the daily routine. We run cattle primarily, but we also have horses for our own use and breed enough to sell a few each year. You'll work all aspects of the operation during this trial month." "Understood. I'll get my things from the boarding house in town and move out here this afternoon." Mason paused, then added, "Miss Granger, I appreciate you giving me this chance. I know it's not easy, a woman in your position partnering with a stranger. I'll do everything I can to prove I'm worth the risk." After Mason left to collect his belongings, Jack found Tessa in the stable, ostensibly checking on the horses but really just thinking. "Well," he asked. "He knows his business," Tessa said. "Everything he said makes sense, and his ideas for a breeding program are solid, could be profitable if we do it right. That's not what I'm asking about." Tessa turned to face her foreman. "Jack, don't start." "Don't start what?" "Noticing that you smiled more in the past 2 hours than I've seen in the past 2 months. That you're considering a partnership with a man you just met when you've turned down a dozen offers from people you've known for years. Those other offers were from men who wanted to take over my ranch, not partner with me. There's a difference." "You're right, there is," Jack said. "And it seems like maybe Mason Irving sees that difference too. I'm just saying be careful. Not because he seems like a bad man, but because you've never let anyone get close enough to matter. If this partnership works out the way I think it might, in more ways than one, you're going to have to figure out what you want." "I want my ranch to thrive and to prove that a woman can succeed without needing a man to do it for her," Tessa said. "And if you can succeed with a man as your equal partner, what then?" Tessa didn't have an answer to that question, so she changed the subject and went back to work. But Jack's words stayed with her throughout the day, especially when Mason returned that evening with his belongings packed in 2 modest saddlebags. A man who could fit his entire life into 2 bags was either running from something or traveling towards something with enough focus that possessions didn't matter. Tessa hoped it was the latter. The first week of Mason's trial period passed quickly. He rose before dawn, worked until after sunset, and approached every task with the same careful attention. Tessa watched him work with the horses and saw immediately that his reputation was deserved. He had a way of moving slowly and deliberately that kept animals calm, and he seemed to understand instinctively how much pressure to apply and when to back off. With people, he was equally skilled. He listened more than he talked, asked questions instead of making assumptions, and treated everyone from Tessa to the youngest ranch hand with the same respectful attention. The ranch hands accepted him faster than Tessa had expected. Part of it was his competence, but part of it was how he positioned himself. He didn't try to take charge or prove himself superior. Instead, he asked how things were done, learned the ranch's rhythms, and offered suggestions as possibilities rather than corrections. Within 3 days, the men were working with him rather than around him, and by the end of the week, she overheard 2 of her hands saying that Irving fellow was all right, knew his business and didn't put on airs. But it was the evenings that surprised Tessa most. After dinner, when the work was done, Mason took to sitting on the porch of his cabin, watching the sunset over the hills while whittling small wooden figures. Tessa found herself inventing reasons to walk past his cabin during those hours, and more often than not, Mason would invite her to sit and talk. They discussed everything during those conversations. He told her about growing up in Missouri, the youngest of 4 sons on a farm that couldn't support them all. He'd headed west at 18, working his way through odd jobs until he'd found his calling with horses. She told him about her father, about learning the ranch alongside grown men, about the loneliness of being the only woman in a world built for men, but also the fierce pride of proving she belonged there anyway. Did you ever want something different? Mason asked one evening about 10 days into his trial period. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and they sat on the porch steps of the main house, each holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold while they talked. "I wanted my father back," Tessa said quietly. "I wanted my mother even though I never knew her. But as for this life, no, I never wanted different. I just wanted people to stop trying to make me fit into their idea of what a woman should be. And what do people think you should be? Married, quiet, domestic. Someone's helper rather than someone with her own goals." Tessa looked at him. "The women in town have made it their mission to find me a husband. They introduce me to every single man who passes through, and they all have the same look when they meet me. Like I'm a problem that needs solving, a wild horse that needs breaking." Mason was quiet for a moment, his hand still whittling the piece of wood he'd been working on. It was starting to look like a horse, she realized, the lines clean and simple but capturing something essential about movement and grace. "I don't think you're a problem," he said finally. "I think you're exactly what you should be. Strong, capable, honest about what you want. The problem isn't you. It's that most men can't handle a woman who doesn't need them. And you can." He looked up from his whittling, his eyes meeting hers in the fading light. "I don't want to be with someone who needs me out of weakness or desperation. I want a partner who chooses me because we're better together than we are apart. That requires strength on both sides, not one person propping up the other." Tessa's heart beat faster, and she had to look away from the intensity of his gaze. "That's a very progressive view, Mr. Irving." "It's common sense, Miss Granger. At least it should be." He went back to his whittling, and after a moment he added, "My mother raised 4 boys on her own after my father died. She ran that farm, made all the decisions, and did it while fighting off every busybody who thought she should remarry for propriety's sake. She taught me that strength isn't about gender. It's about character. I've never forgotten that." They sat in comfortable silence after that, and Tessa felt something settle in her chest, a recognition that Mason Irving might be the first man she'd ever met who truly understood what she needed. Not someone to take care of her or make decisions for her, but someone who could stand beside her as an equal, complementing her strengths rather than trying to replace them. The second week brought unexpected challenges. 3 of Tessa's best breeding cows went missing from the north pasture, and the tracks suggested it wasn't natural wandering. Someone had deliberately cut the fence and driven them out. Tessa, Mason, and Jack rode out to investigate, bringing 2 other ranch hands for backup. They found the cows 5 miles north, being herded toward the county line by 2 men Tessa recognized immediately. The younger one was Ray Dawson's cousin, Pete, and the older one was a known rustler named Frank Carver. When they spotted Tessa and her group, Pete reached for his gun, but Mason was faster. "I wouldn't," Mason said, his voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. His gun was drawn and aimed before Pete's hand had fully closed on his weapon. "We outnumber you, and theft of livestock is a hanging offense. You really want to add murder to that charge?" Frank Carver, who'd been around long enough to recognize a losing situation, raised his hand slowly. "Now, Miss Granger, this is just a misunderstanding. We found these cows wandering, thought they were wild stock. With my brand clearly visible," Tessa said coldly. "Frank, I've known you were a thief for years, but I didn't think you were stupid. Ray Dawson put you up to this, didn't he? Trying to hurt my operation because I testified against his brother." Pete spat on the ground. "You should have kept your mouth shut, woman. Cole never would have been convicted if not for you." "Cole was convicted because he's a thief and I told the truth," Tessa said. "Now you've got two choices. You can come back with us peacefully and face the sheriff, or you can try something stupid and face the consequences here. I'm fine with either option." They chose to come peacefully, though Pete glared at Tessa the whole ride back. Jack and one of the hands took the prisoners into town while Tessa, Mason, and the other hand drove the cattle back to the ranch. By the time they returned, it was late afternoon, and Tessa felt the familiar weight of frustration settling on her shoulders. "This won't stop," she said to Mason as they unsaddled their horses. "Ray Dawson won't let this go. He'll keep coming at my ranch trying to hurt me through my property and my people." "Then we need to end it," Mason said. "One way or another, this has to be resolved. You can't run a ranch while constantly watching your back. What do you suggest?" "Ray and his gang are too smart to get caught easily. They'll keep picking at me from a distance, rustling cattle, cutting fences, maybe worse." Mason was quiet for a moment, his hands moving methodically through the task of caring for his horse. "In Texas, when I was younger, I worked for a rancher who had a similar problem. Bandits kept hitting his supply wagons, never enough to destroy him but enough to be a constant drain. He tried guards, tried changing routes, tried everything. Finally, he did something that seemed crazy at the time. He invited the bandit leader to dinner." Tessa stared at him. "He what? Invited him to dinner?" "Sent a message through a mutual acquaintance that he wanted to talk business. No tricks, no traps. The bandit leader was curious enough to show up, and they worked out a deal. The rancher hired some of the bandits as guards for his wagons. They knew all the tricks, all the hiding spots, so they were perfect for the job. The attacks stopped because the people causing them had a better option." "You think I should offer Ray Dawson a job?" Tessa said incredulously. "No, Ray's too far gone, too invested in his anger. But I think you should talk to him, find out what he really wants. Maybe it's money to leave the territory, maybe it's something else. But right now, you're in a war of attrition that benefits no one. At least talking gives you information." Tessa wanted to dismiss the idea immediately, but she'd learned to respect Mason's judgment over the past 2 weeks. "And if talking doesn't work, if he just uses a meeting to try and kill me, then we make sure you're protected. We choose the location, bring backup, and have an escape plan. But we also give him a chance to end this without more violence. If he refuses, at least you'll know you tried the peaceful route first." They debated it for another hour, eventually bringing Jack into the conversation. Her foreman was skeptical, but eventually agreed that the situation couldn't continue as it was. They needed to force a resolution, and talking was the lowest risk option to try first. The next morning, Tessa rode into town and sent a message to Ray Dawson through the bartender at the saloon where his gang was known to drink. She proposed a meeting at the old mission ruins 5 miles west of town, neutral ground that neither of them controlled, 3 days hence at noon. She didn't know if he'd show, but 2 days later she received a reply. Ray would meet her, but she had to come alone. Tessa sent back that she'd come with one other person or not at all. If he wanted to talk, it would be on terms that gave them both some security. After a tense wait, Ray agreed. "I'm coming with you," Mason said when she told him about the meeting. It wasn't a question. I know, Tessa said. I wouldn't trust anyone else to watch my back. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning beyond their surface. Over the past 2.5 weeks, Mason had become more than a potential business partner. He'd become someone she relied on, someone whose presence made her feel more capable rather than less, someone she trusted in a way she'd never trusted anyone except her father and Jack. The realization should have frightened her, but instead it felt right, like a piece clicking into place that she hadn't known was missing. The day of the meeting dawned cloudy and cool, the threat of rain hanging in the air. Tessa dressed carefully, wearing practical riding clothes and her father's gun belt. She braided her hair tightly, wanting nothing loose that could be grabbed in a fight. Mason checked their rifles twice, loaded extra ammunition, and surveyed the route they'd take, identifying potential ambush points and planning alternatives. "You don't have to do this," he said as they prepared to ride out. "We could go to the sheriff, ask for help, let the law handle it." "The law hasn't been able to touch Ray Dawson yet," Tessa said. "Besides, this is personal now. He's targeted my ranch, my livelihood, because I told the truth about his brother. I won't let fear dictate how I run my life or my business." Mason smiled slightly. "I figured you'd say that. Just wanted to make sure you'd thought it through." They rode out at mid-morning, giving themselves plenty of time to reach the mission ruins and assess the situation before Ray arrived. The old mission had been abandoned for 20 years, its adobe walls crumbling and roof long since collapsed, but the location offered good sightlines and multiple escape routes. They tied their horses in a protected spot behind the remaining walls and waited. Ray Dawson arrived exactly at noon, riding in from the north with one other man beside him. He was younger than Tessa had expected, maybe 27 or 28, with the lean, hard look of someone who'd lived rough and trusted no one. He dismounted slowly, his hand never far from his gun, and approached to within 20 feet before stopping. "Miss Granger," he said, his voice carrying a mocking edge. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. Most women would be hiding behind their men, not setting up meetings in the middle of nowhere." "I'm not most women," Tessa said. "And I don't hide behind anyone. You wanted my attention, Ray. You've got it. Now let's talk about why you're so determined to destroy everything I've built." Ray's expression hardened. "You destroyed my brother's life. He's sitting in prison because of you, doing 5 years for rustling. That's 5 years of his life gone because you couldn't keep your mouth shut. Your brother is in prison because he stole from me and 3 other ranchers," Tessa said. "I didn't put him there. His choices did. I just told the truth about what I saw. You could have looked the other way, could have handled it privately, ranch to ranch. But no, you had to involve the law, had to make an example of him. You think because you're a woman running a ranch that you have to prove yourself by being harder than any man would be." Tessa felt anger flare in her chest, but she kept her voice level. "Your brother didn't steal from me because I'm a woman. He stole because he thought he could get away with it, and I didn't go to the law to prove anything. I went because theft is theft, and if I let it slide, every rustler in the territory would see my ranch as easy pickings. I did what any rancher would do, man or woman." "Well, now you're paying the price for that choice," Ray said. "And I'm not done yet. I can keep hitting your ranch until you've got nothing left. Steal your cattle, run off your horses, burn your fields. Eventually, you'll break." Mason, who'd been silent until now, stepped forward slightly. "Or you could take the $500 Miss Granger is offering and leave the territory. Head to Oregon or Washington. Start fresh somewhere the law isn't looking for you. Keep hitting her ranch and eventually you'll make a mistake. You'll get caught or killed, and for what? Revenge that won't bring your brother home any sooner." Ray's attention shifted to Mason, assessing him carefully. And who are you? New hired gun. I'm her partner, Mason said. And I'm someone who knows what it's like to want revenge for family. My oldest brother was killed by claim jumpers in Nevada. They beat him to death and threw his body in an abandoned mine shaft. I spent 2 years tracking them, planning what I'd do when I found them. You know what happened when I finally caught up to them? Ray didn't answer, just waited. They were already dead, Mason continued. Not from anything I did. One got killed in a saloon fight, one died of fever, and one got hanged for murdering a different man. All that anger, all that planning, and in the end, life had already dealt with them. I'd wasted 2 years of my life on rage that served no purpose. Your brother made his choices, and he's paying for them. You making the same kind of bad choices won't help him. It'll just put you in a cell next to his or in the ground. Ray was quiet for a long moment, and Tessa could see the conflict playing across his face. He wanted revenge, needed it, but he also wasn't stupid. He knew Mason was right about the risks. Finally, he said, $1,000 and I'm gone within a week. That's my counter-offer. 700, Tessa said. That's enough to set you up somewhere new with money to spare. But you leave within 3 days, and if I ever hear you're back in this territory causing trouble, the deal's off, and I'll make sure every lawman from here to the Nevada border knows your face. They settled on $750, to be delivered in 2 days at the same location. Ray and his companion rode off, and Tessa let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Do you think he'll keep his word?" she asked Mason. "I think he'll take the money and leave," Mason said. "Whether he stays gone depends on whether he finds something better wherever he ends up. But at least it gives you breathing room and ends the immediate threat." They rode back to the ranch in thoughtful silence. Tessa kept thinking about what Mason had revealed about his brother, the pain in his voice when he talked about wasted years of anger. She'd known loss, but she'd never had the luxury of pursuing revenge. Running the ranch had demanded all her attention, forcing her to focus on survival and success rather than past hurts. She wondered what kind of strength it had taken for Mason to let go of that anger, to choose a different path. That evening, after the ranch work was done and the hands had settled in for the night, Tessa found Mason at his usual spot on the cabin porch. But instead of whittling, he was just sitting, staring out at the darkening hills. She sat down beside him without asking, and they stayed silent for a while, listening to the crickets and the distant sounds of cattle settling down. "Tell me about your brother," she said finally. "The one who died. What was his name?" "Matthew," Mason said quietly. "He was 10 years older than me, more like a father than a brother after ours died. He came west first, made some money in the silver mines, sent for the rest of us. I was just 19 when I joined him in Nevada. He taught me everything about surviving in the territories, about reading people, about working hard and staying honest even when everyone around you was cutting corners. What happened? He staked a claim that turned out to have a decent silver vein. Nothing huge, but enough to be worth protecting. 3 men from a neighboring claim decided they wanted it. They waited until I'd gone into town for supplies, then they confronted Matthew at our camp. They beat him with shovels, took our equipment and supplies, and left him to die. By the time I got back the next day, animals had already found him." Tessa reached over and took his hand, the gesture surprising both of them, but Mason's fingers closed around hers, holding on like she was anchoring him to the present instead of that terrible memory. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm sorry you lost him that way, and I'm sorry you carried that anger for so long." "It changed me," Mason said. "Made me harder for a while. I stopped trusting people, stopped seeing the good in things. It took a long time to find my way back to the person Matthew had tried to teach me to be. That's why I talked to Ray Dawson about revenge. I recognized that look in his eyes, that certainty that punishing someone else would make the pain less. It won't. It just spreads the pain around until everyone's suffering. They sat holding hands until the stars came out, and Tessa felt something fundamental shift between them. This wasn't just attraction or respect anymore. This was the beginning of real intimacy, the kind built on shared vulnerability and mutual understanding. She'd never let anyone see her doubts or fears, had always maintained the strong front necessary to be taken seriously in a man's world. But with Mason, she felt safe enough to be whole, to show strength and uncertainty, confidence and questions. 2 days later, they delivered the money to Ray Dawson as promised. He counted it, nodded curtly, and rode off without another word. 3 days after that, Jack confirmed through his contacts in town that the Dawson gang had been seen heading north toward Oregon. The threat was over, and Tessa could finally breathe easily for the first time in months. Mason's trial month ended that week, and Tessa knew she had a decision to make. The partnership he'd proposed had proven even more valuable than she'd expected. His ideas for the breeding program were sound, his work ethic was flawless, and his presence had become essential to how she envisioned the ranch's future. But it was more than that, and she couldn't ignore it anymore. Somewhere between that first conversation in town and sitting beside him under the stars, she'd started falling in love with him. The realization terrified her. She'd built her entire adult life around independence, around proving she didn't need anyone, especially not a man. Falling in love meant risking that independence, risking the possibility that he'd expect her to change, to become softer or more conventional, to fit herself into his vision of what a woman should be. But when she looked at how Mason treated her, how he talked to her and listened to her and worked beside her as an equal, she couldn't find evidence of those expectations. He seemed to love exactly who she was, strength and stubbornness and all. She found him in the stable one evening, brushing down granite after a long day of working with the horses they'd selected as potential breeding stock. The month had transformed him from a stranger to someone who belonged on the ranch as naturally as the hills and the grass. "Your trial month is up," Tessa said without preamble. She'd never been good at dancing around important topics. Mason paused in his brushing but didn't turn around. "I know. Have you made your decision?" "I want to formalize the partnership," Tessa said. "Everything you've done this month has proven you're exactly the partner I need. Your knowledge, your work ethic, your judgment, it's all been exceptional. Jack's already said he couldn't imagine the ranch without you, and the hands respect you. The breeding program you've outlined could transform this operation into something that outlasts both of us." "But," Mason said, finally turning to face her, "but I need to know something first. What do you see when you look at me, Mason? Do you see a partner in business, someone useful for your plans? Or do you see something more? Because I need to understand what this is before I commit to working beside you for years." Mason set down the brush and walked toward her slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "I see everything, Tessa. I see the strongest, most capable woman I've ever met. I see someone who's faced down outlaws and town gossips with the same courage. I see intelligence and determination, and a stubborn refusal to be anything less than exactly who you are. And yes, I see someone I've fallen in love with, even though I know that complicates everything we're trying to build." Tessa's breath caught. She'd hoped, but hearing the words spoken aloud was different. "The town already gossips about us working together. If we're together as more than business partners, they'll say I'm just another woman who couldn't make it alone, that I needed a man after all." "Let them talk," Mason said. "You and I both know the truth. You don't need me to run this ranch. You've been doing it successfully for years." But we could build something together that's bigger and better than what either of us could do alone. That's not weakness. That's wisdom. And as for what we are to each other personally, that's nobody's business but ours. You really think we can do both? Be business partners and something more? I think we can do anything we set our minds to, Mason said. He was close enough now that she could feel the warmth of him, see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. But only if it's what you want. I won't push you into something that compromises what you've built or who you are. I'd rather have you as just a business partner than not have you in my life at all. Tessa made her decision in that moment, letting her heart finally overrule the fears she'd carried for so long. She closed the distance between them and kissed him, and it felt like coming home and setting out on a new adventure all at once. Mason's arms came around her, strong and sure, and for the first time in her life, Tessa understood that being held didn't mean being trapped. When they finally broke apart, Mason was smiling. So, is that a yes to the partnership? Yes to all of it, Tessa said. Business partners, life partners, all of it. But we do this as equals, Mason. You don't get to make decisions for me, and I don't fade into the background. We build this together, both names on everything, both voices carrying equal weight. I wouldn't have it any other way, Mason said. He kissed her again, softer this time, a promise rather than a discovery. Though fair warning, when we tell the town, Mrs. Henderson might faint from shock. Mrs. Henderson can faint all she wants, Tessa said. I spent years letting people's opinions make me defensive and isolated. I'm done with that. Let them say what they want. They said I was too independent for marriage, that no man would want a woman with strength. You just proved them wrong on every count. They told Jack first, naturally, and the old foreman just laughed. About time you two figured it out. I've been watching you dance around each other for weeks. Got so I almost said something myself, but I figured you needed to work it out on your own. They drew up the partnership papers the next week with a lawyer from Sacramento who handled large ranch operations. Everything was split fairly, with both their names on all the documents, all the assets protected, and clear terms about how decisions would be made. The lawyer, a practical woman named Sarah Chen, who'd managed to succeed in a male-dominated profession through sheer competence, approved of their arrangement. It's rare to see a true partnership between a man and a woman in this business, she said. Usually, one or the other gets subsumed into a traditional marriage structure, regardless of what the papers say. But you two seem to have thought this through carefully. Just remember that successful partnerships require ongoing communication and willingness to adapt. What works now might need adjustment in 5 years or 10. They were married in November, a simple ceremony at the ranch with Jack serving as witness and the ranch hands in attendance. Tessa wore a practical dress that allowed her to ride out to check the cattle the same day, because 2 of the new calves had been showing signs of illness. Mason wore his best shirt and actually combed his hair, though by evening it was wind-blown again from riding. The preacher from town was scandalized by the casual nature of the ceremony, but he performed it anyway because everyone knew arguing with Tessa Granger was a losing proposition. And apparently, Mason Irving wasn't much different. Mrs. Henderson and her circle of friends came to the ranch a week after the wedding, ostensibly to offer congratulations but really to see if the rumors were true that Tessa had married without giving up control of her property. Mrs. Irving, Mrs. Henderson said, emphasizing the new name, or do you still go by Miss Granger? I confess I'm unclear on your arrangement. I go by both, depending on context, Tessa said calmly. They were sitting on the ranch house porch, and Tessa had made coffee more out of politeness than any real desire to entertain these women. For business purposes, I'm still Tessa Granger because that's the name on my property deeds and contracts. In personal life, I'm Tessa Irving. It's not complicated, and your husband is comfortable with this unusual arrangement." Another woman asked, her tone suggesting that no proper man would be. "My husband suggested it," Mason said, appearing from around the side of the house where he'd been repairing a fence. He was dusty and clearly in the middle of work, but he'd never been one to miss an opportunity to support Tessa. "My wife built this ranch from the ground up. It seems foolish to change names on legal documents just because we got married. Besides, we're partners in everything. Her success is my success and vice versa. But surely, there must be times when someone needs to make final decisions," Mrs. Henderson pressed. "When you disagree about the direction of the ranch or your breeding program. Then we talk until we reach a compromise," Tessa said. "Just like any good business partners would. Marriage doesn't change that. If anything, it makes it more important to communicate well." The women left shortly after, their curiosity only partially satisfied but clearly uncomfortable with how different Tessa's marriage was from their expectations. After they'd gone, Mason sat down beside Tessa on the porch steps, and she leaned against his shoulder. "You think they'll ever accept that we're happy doing things our own way?" she asked. "Probably not," Mason said. "But I stopped caring what people like that think years ago. The only opinions that matter are ours, Jack's, and maybe the horses. Everyone else is just noise." That winter was one of the happiest of Tessa's life. She and Mason worked side by side during the days, building the breeding program, improving the ranch infrastructure, and planning for the future. In the evenings, they'd sit by the fire in the ranch house that was now theirs together, talking about everything and nothing, comfortable in the silence when words weren't needed. The intimacy they'd built during Mason's trial month deepened into something profound, a connection that went beyond physical attraction or mutual respect into genuine partnership. They disagreed sometimes, even argued occasionally, but they'd established early on that they would always talk through their differences rather than letting resentment build. Mason had a tendency to take on too much himself, forgetting that he had help available, and Tessa had to remind him that asking for assistance wasn't weakness. Tessa sometimes made decisions without consulting him when she felt time was crucial, and Mason had to remind her that partnership meant keeping each other informed even when moving fast. But they learned each other's rhythms, adapted to each other's working styles, and discovered that their differences often complemented rather than conflicted. Tessa was better at long-term strategic planning, seeing how current decisions would affect the ranch years down the line. Mason was better at reading people and situations in the moment, making tactical adjustments that kept them flexible. Together, they formed something stronger than either could have been alone. The breeding program began to show real promise by the spring of 1879. Mason had purchased 3 mares and 2 stallions over the winter, carefully selected for temperament and conformation. The first foals weren't due until the following year, but word had spread about the Irving Granger breeding program, and they already had inquiries from ranchers as far away as Utah. Mason spent hours each day working with the horses, building trust and establishing good habits, while Tessa handled the business side, negotiating contracts and managing their growing reputation. In May, Tessa realized she was pregnant. She'd suspected for a few weeks, but had waited to be sure before telling Mason. She found him in the training corral one evening, working with a young gelding that showed promise as a cattle horse. She climbed up on the fence and watched for a while, appreciating the easy confidence of his movements, the patience he showed with the animal. When he finished the session and approached the fence, she said without preamble. "We're going to need to build another room on the house." Mason looked confused for a moment, then understanding dawned in his eyes. "You're pregnant. About 3 months along, I think. The doctor in Sacramento confirmed it yesterday when I went to meet with the feed supplier. I wanted to be sure before I said anything." Mason's face transformed, joy and wonder and a touch of fear all mixed together. He climbed the fence to sit beside her, taking her hand. "How do you feel about it?" "Terrified," Tessa admitted. "My mother died giving birth to me. I've always been afraid that would be my fate too, but also happy." "Excited. This is something we made together, another kind of partnership. We'll get the best doctor in California here for the birth," Mason said. "Money doesn't matter. Whatever you need to be safe and healthy, we'll make it happen." "I don't want to stop working," Tessa said. "I know people will expect me to spend the pregnancy resting, being delicate, but I'll go crazy if I can't stay involved in the ranch. Then we adjust how you work as needed, but we don't stop," Mason said. "Though I reserve the right to worry about you and possibly become an overprotective nuisance." "Possibly," Tessa said with a slight smile. "Mason, you already check on me 3 times a day to make sure I've eaten and am not working too hard." "Then I'll become more of an overprotective nuisance," he said, but he was smiling too. He placed his hand gently on her stomach, and even though there was no visible sign of the baby yet, the gesture felt profound. "We're going to be parents." "Yes, we are. And we're going to teach this child that strength comes from integrity and hard work, that partnerships are built on respect and communication, and that what other people think matters far less than being true to yourself." The pregnancy progressed normally, though Tessa did have to accept some limitations as her body changed. By July, she could no longer ride for long hours, which frustrated her immensely, but Mason helped her find other ways to stay involved. She focused more on the business side of the operation, handling correspondence, managing accounts, and planning their expansion. Jack took on more of the daily oversight of the cattle operation, though he reported to both Tessa and Mason equally, just as they'd always arranged. In August, they hired 2 additional ranch hands to help manage the increased workload from the breeding program. One was a young man named Thomas who'd grown up on a horse ranch in Kentucky and had excellent knowledge of training techniques. The other was a woman named Elizabeth Sullivan, no relation to Jack, who'd been working ranches since she was 14 and had finally saved enough money to head west looking for better opportunities. Tessa had insisted on interviewing her personally, and within 10 minutes, she'd recognized a kindred spirit, someone who refused to be limited by gender expectations. "You understand that this is hard work?" Tessa asked during the interview. "Long hours, difficult conditions, and you'll be working with men who might not be happy about a woman on the crew." "Madam, I've been dealing with that my whole life," Elizabeth said. She was 21, weathered beyond her years with strong hands and direct eyes. "Any man who's got a problem with me being here can take it up with the quality of my work. I can rope, ride, and handle cattle as well as anyone you've got. I'm not looking for special treatment, just a fair wage and a chance to prove myself." "You're hired," Tessa said. "Same pay as the men, same expectations. You bunk in the cabin behind the stable, and if anyone gives you trouble about being a woman, you come to me or Mason immediately. We don't tolerate that on this ranch." Elizabeth proved to be one of the best decisions they'd made. She worked harder than anyone, asked smart questions, and handled the horses with natural skill. Within a month, even the ranch hands who'd been skeptical were admitting she pulled her weight and then some. For Tessa, it was particularly satisfying to provide the kind of opportunity she'd had to fight so hard to claim for herself. The baby came in early December, 2 weeks earlier than expected. The doctor had set up a room in the ranch house, prepared for the birth. But when Tessa's labor started suddenly, while she was reviewing accounts at her desk, there was a frantic few hours of getting everything ready. Mason stayed with her the entire time, holding her hand, talking to her through the pain, refusing to be banished to another room despite the doctor's suggestions that childbirth was no place for a man. "She's my wife and this is our child," Mason said firmly. "I'm staying." It was a difficult birth. 18 hours of hard labor that left Tessa exhausted and frightened. There was a terrible moment when the baby was born silent, and the doctor worked frantically to clear his airway and get him breathing. Mason had gone white with fear, and Tessa had been too exhausted to do anything but wait and pray. Then came the most beautiful sound she'd ever heard, her son crying loudly, announcing his presence to the world. "You have a healthy baby boy," the doctor said, placing the squalling infant in Tessa's arms. 10 fingers, 10 toes, and clearly has his mother's stubbornness if the way he fought to get here is any indication. Tessa looked down at her son, overwhelmed by the fierce love that surged through her. He was red-faced and wrinkled and absolutely perfect. Mason leaned over them both, his eyes wet with tears, and touched the baby's tiny hand with one finger. The infant's fingers curled around it instinctively, and Mason made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "What should we name him?" Tessa asked. They discussed names throughout the pregnancy but hadn't been able to settle on one definitively. Now, looking at their son, Mason said, "Matthew, after my brother, he would have loved to meet this little one." "Matthew Irving," Tessa said, testing how it sounded. "Matthew Thomas Irving after your brother and my father. He'll carry both their legacies." "And make his own," Mason added. "With parents like us, he won't have any choice but to be independent and strong-willed." "God help us," Tessa said, but she was smiling. The first months of Matthew's life were exhausting in ways neither of them had anticipated. Tessa had expected to return to full ranch duties within a few weeks, but the reality of caring for an infant proved more demanding than she'd imagined. She'd grown up on a ranch and knew how to handle difficult calving and long hours in bad weather, but nothing had prepared her for the relentless needs of a newborn. Mason proved surprisingly adept at fatherhood, taking night shifts when he could, changing diapers without complaint, and somehow managing to work the ranch during the day despite minimal sleep. They muddled through together, learning as they went, and by the time Matthew was 3 months old, they'd established a routine that worked. Tessa brought the baby with her when doing paperwork, kept him in a basket near wherever she was working when she could, and gradually resumed more of her ranch duties. Mason built a special carrier that allowed her to strap Matthew to her body while doing light work, keeping her hands free but the baby close. Mrs. Henderson, of course, had opinions about this arrangement. She came to call one spring afternoon in 1880 and found Tessa in the stable with 6-month-old Matthew strapped to her chest while she examined a mare's infected hoof. "Mrs. Irving, surely this is inappropriate," she said. "A baby should be in a cradle, not in a barn around large animals and dirt. And you should be in the house, caring for him properly, not working like a common hand." Tessa looked up from the hoof she was treating, her patience thin from a sleepless night and a long morning. "Mrs. Henderson, my son is perfectly safe, well-fed, and getting more attention from both his parents than most children receive. How I choose to care for him while running my ranch is my business, not yours. Now, unless you have something productive to contribute, I need to finish treating this infection before it gets worse." Mason, who'd been working in a nearby stall, appeared beside Tessa. "Madam, I think what my wife is trying to say is that we appreciate your concern, but we've got our own way of doing things," Matthew's thriving, the ranch is thriving, and we're happy. That's what matters. After Mrs. Henderson left in a huff, Tessa leaned against Mason's shoulder, suddenly tired. Will we ever stop having to justify our choices to other people? Probably not, Mason said. But we also don't have to listen. Let's worry about what we think is right and let everyone else figure out their own lives. As Matthew grew from an infant into a toddler, his personality emerged strong and curious, equal parts both parents. He had Tessa's determination and Mason's patience, demanding to help with ranch work from the moment he could walk. By the time he was 2, he was tagging along behind Mason to the training corrals, watching the horses with rapt attention and trying to mimic everything he saw. The breeding program had grown beyond their initial projections. By 1881, they'd produced 12 foals that were showing exactly the qualities Mason had bred for: hardiness, intelligence, and stable temperaments. Ranchers throughout California and Nevada were requesting Irving Granger horses, and they'd had to turn down more contracts than they accepted because they refused to compromise on quality by overextending. They'd also expanded the ranch, purchasing 2 adjacent properties from neighbors who were retiring. The additional land allowed them to separate the breeding operation more clearly from the cattle ranching, giving each sufficient space without the operations interfering with each other. They'd hired 4 more workers, including another woman named Patricia Chen, who was Sarah Chen, the lawyer's niece, and equally competent. Tessa was 26 now, and when she looked at everything she and Mason had built, she felt profound satisfaction. They'd created something remarkable, a ranch that was respected throughout the territory, a breeding program that was changing how people thought about working horses, and a family that defied conventional expectations, but worked beautifully nonetheless. In the summer of 1882, Tessa realized she was pregnant again. This time she was less frightened, knowing what to expect, though she still harbored concerns about the birth. Mason was predictably overjoyed and even more overprotective than the first time, until Tessa had to sit him down and remind him that she was pregnant, not made of glass. "I carried Matthew for 9 months while running this ranch," she pointed out. "I can handle being pregnant while we continue our normal work. Yes, I'll be careful. Yes, I'll slow down when needed. But no, I'm not going to spend 7 months sitting in a chair being decorative." Their daughter arrived in March of 1883, a week late, and taking her time about entering the world in what the doctor called the easiest birth he'd supervised in months. She was smaller than Matthew had been, with a cap of dark hair and surprisingly alert eyes that seemed to take in everything from the moment she opened them. "Sarah," Tessa said immediately. "After Sarah Chen, who helped us build this business properly. Sarah Grace Irving." "It's perfect," Mason agreed, holding his daughter with the same wonder he'd shown with Matthew. "Our little Sarah." If Matthew had been strong-willed and active, Sarah was observant and thoughtful, content to watch the world for long periods before acting. Even as an infant, she seemed to study everything with intense concentration, and by the time she was a year old, Tessa swore the child was sizing up situations with more wisdom than some adults she knew. The years flowed by, marked by the rhythms of ranch work, the changing seasons, and the growth of their family. Matthew grew tall and lean like his father, with an uncanny ability to connect with horses and a quiet confidence that served him well. Sarah grew into a whip-smart, determined child who asked endless questions and refused to accept, "because I said so," as an explanation for anything. They educated both children at home, teaching them reading, writing, and mathematics alongside practical ranch skills. Tessa insisted they learn the business side of the operation, as well as the physical work, while Mason made sure they understood animal behavior and husbandry. By the time Matthew was 8 and Sarah was 5, both could ride competently, help with basic ranch chores, and recite the principles of responsible horse breeding. In 1888, when Tessa was 33 and Mason was 39, they received an honor that validated everything they'd built. The California Ranching Association invited them to speak at their annual conference in San Francisco about their breeding program and their partnership model. It was the first time the association had invited a woman to speak, and there had been significant controversy about the decision. They made the journey to San Francisco together, leaving the children with Jack and Elizabeth, who'd become something of a surrogate aunt to both. The city was overwhelming after years of ranch life, but the conference itself was fascinating. They met ranchers from throughout the West, saw innovations in equipment and techniques, and connected with potential breeding clients they never would have reached otherwise. Their presentation was scheduled for the second day, and Tessa was nervous in a way she rarely allowed herself to feel. This was a room full of men who'd spent their lives in ranching, many of whom had probably dismissed women's capabilities without a second thought. She wore practical clothing rather than trying to dress like the society women she'd seen in the city, determined to present herself honestly. Mason spoke first, outlining the breeding program's methodology, the bloodlines they'd chosen, and the results they'd achieved. Then Tessa took over, discussing the business model, the financial returns, and the market analysis that had guided their decisions. She spoke clearly and confidently, backing up every claim with data, and refused to be intimidated by the skeptical faces in the audience. During the question period, one older rancher stood up and said bluntly, "Mrs. Irving, this is all very impressive, but everyone knows women don't have the head for complex business operations. Surely your husband does the real planning and you're just here for show." The room went silent, everyone waiting to see how she'd respond. Mason started to stand, ready to defend her, but Tessa touched his arm, keeping him seated. This was her fight. "Sir, I've been running a ranch since I was 18 years old," she said calmly. "I've managed budgets, negotiated contracts, hired and supervised workers, and made strategic decisions that have grown my family's property into one of the most respected operations in Northern California. My husband is an equal partner in our breeding program, and his expertise with horses is unmatched. But I handle the business operations because that's my skill set, just as he handles the training because that's his. Partnership means recognizing each person's strengths and utilizing them appropriately. If you can't imagine a woman having the capacity for complex business operations, I'd suggest the limitation is in your imagination, not in women's capabilities." Several people in the audience actually applauded, and even the skeptical rancher sat down looking chastened. After the presentation, they were surrounded by people wanting to discuss partnerships, breeding programs, and yes, how to structure operations that utilized everyone's talents regardless of gender. "You were magnificent," Mason told her that evening as they prepared for the conference dinner. "I've never been prouder of you." "I was terrified," Tessa admitted, "but I was also angry. Angry at all the years of people underestimating me, angry at the assumption that being a woman means being less capable. I let that anger fuel my response, and it worked." "It worked because you backed it up with results," Mason said. "Words are easy. What you've built is harder and more impressive than any speech." The dinner that evening was a formal affair, and Tessa felt distinctly out of place in the fancy dress she'd bought specifically for this event. She was used to practical clothing, to moving freely, and the restrictions of formal women's fashion irritated her. But she endured it because making connections at events like this was part of business, and she'd never let discomfort prevent her from doing what was necessary. They returned to the ranch a week later, exhausted but energized by new ideas and connections. Matthew and Sarah greeted them enthusiastically, full of stories about adventures with Jack and Elizabeth, and the ranch looked exactly as they'd left it, testament to the quality of people they employed. "I missed this," Tessa said that first evening back, standing on the porch and looking out over land that had been in her family for more than 30 years. "The city was interesting, but this is home." "This will always be home," Mason agreed, standing beside her with his arm around her waist. "Everything we've built, everything we are, it's all rooted here." The 1890s brought new challenges and opportunities. The West was changing, becoming less wild and more settled. The Transcontinental Railroad had made travel easier, and more people were moving to California, drawn by stories of opportunity and mild weather. Towns were growing into cities, territories were becoming states, and the frontier was slowly disappearing. The ranching industry was evolving too. New techniques, better breeding practices, and improved equipment were making operations more efficient, but also more competitive. The Irving Granger Ranch adapted by focusing on quality over quantity, maintaining their reputation for producing the best working horses in California. They weathered economic downturns by diversifying, adding sheep ranching to their cattle operation and establishing a contract to supply horses to the U.S. cavalry. Matthew, now in his late teens, was becoming a skilled horseman in his own right, working alongside Mason and developing his own ideas about breeding. He'd inherited both parents' independent spirit and wasn't content to simply follow established methods. He wanted to experiment with new bloodlines, try different training techniques, and push the boundaries of what their program could achieve. Tessa and Mason encouraged his innovations, remembering how they'd both had to fight for the freedom to try new approaches. Sarah, at 15, showed more interest in the business side of ranching than the physical work. She had a brilliant mind for numbers and strategy, and she'd taken over managing the ranch's accounts from Tessa, who joked that their daughter was better at it than she'd ever been. Sarah also had strong opinions about everything, and no hesitation about expressing them, which led to spirited debates at the dinner table that Tessa secretly enjoyed even when they were exhausting. In 1896, Tessa's 50th birthday approached, though she refused to make a fuss about it. She'd lived a full, rich life, achieving everything she'd set out to do and more. The ranch was prosperous, her children were healthy and capable, and her partnership with Mason remained as strong as ever. They'd been married for 17 years, and rather than the passion fading as people had predicted, it had deepened into something profound and irreplaceable. On the morning of her birthday, Mason woke her before dawn and led her outside to the training corral. There, standing in the early light, was the most beautiful horse Tessa had ever seen. A mare, dappled gray with perfect conformation and intelligent eyes, clearly the product of years of careful breeding. "Her name is Tempest," Mason said. "She's from the last foal our original breeding pair produced before they got too old to breed safely. I've been training her for 2 years, working with her every day, shaping her into exactly what I knew you'd want. She's fast, smart, steady, and she has the heart of a warrior, just like you." Tessa approached the mare slowly, letting her sniff her hand before touching her. Tempest stood calmly, accepting the attention with dignity, and when Tessa ran her hand down the horse's neck, she felt the power and grace in every line of her body. "She's perfect," Tessa said, her voice catching with emotion. "Mason, this is the best gift anyone's ever given me. "You've given me 17 years of happiness and partnership," Mason said. "You've built a family with me, supported my dreams, challenged me to be better, and loved me even when I was difficult. One horse doesn't come close to repaying that debt, but I hope it shows you how much you mean to me." They stood together in the early morning light, the mare between them, and Tessa felt overwhelmed by gratitude for the life she'd chosen. She'd been told she was too independent for marriage, too strong-willed to make a good wife, too invested in her own ambitions to ever find a partner. But Mason had proven that the right person didn't want to diminish her strength. He wanted to stand beside it, complement it, and build something together that neither could have achieved alone. By 1900, Matthew was 20 and working the ranch as a full partner with his parents. He'd married a woman named Rachel from Sacramento, a teacher's daughter who'd come west with her family and fallen in love with both Matthew and the ranching life. Sarah, at 17, showed no interest in marriage yet, focused instead on expanding their business connections and exploring new markets for their horses. "She reminds me of you at that age," Mason told Tessa one evening as they watched Sarah ride out to check on a new group of foals. Determined to prove herself, independent to a fault, and brilliant in ways people don't always appreciate immediately. "God help whoever eventually catches her attention," Tessa said. "They'll need strength to match hers." "Just like I needed strength to match yours," Mason said. "Seems to me it worked out pretty well." They were in their early 50s now, and while the physical demands of ranch work were harder than they'd been 20 years ago, neither showed any sign of slowing down. The ranch was in capable hands with Matthew and the long-term workers they'd trained over the years, but Tessa and Mason remained actively involved in all major decisions. They'd built this operation together, and they intended to continue guiding it as long as they were able. In 1903, Sarah announced at dinner one evening that she'd been corresponding with a man named David Foster who ran a horse ranch in Montana. He'd contacted them about potentially purchasing breeding stock, and their professional correspondence had evolved into something more personal. He was planning to visit California in the fall to meet in person and discuss both business and personal possibilities. "You're telling us you've been conducting a courtship through letters?" Tessa asked, amused and impressed. "I'm telling you, I've found someone who treats my business acumen as an asset rather than a problem," Sarah said. "He wants a partner who can help him build his ranch, someone with knowledge and drive. He's not looking for a decorative wife who'll host tea parties." "That's the kind of man I might be interested in." When David Foster arrived in September, Tessa and Mason evaluated him with the careful attention they'd give a potential breeding stallion. He was 23, well-spoken, clearly knowledgeable about ranching, and most importantly, he listened when Sarah talked and responded to her ideas with genuine interest rather than condescension. By the time he left 3 weeks later, an engagement had been agreed upon, though the wedding wouldn't be until the following summer to give both families time to prepare. The wedding in June 1904 was held at the ranch, a much larger affair than Tessa and Mason's simple ceremony 23 years earlier. Friends and business associates came from throughout California and beyond, turning the event into something between a wedding and a ranching conference. Sarah wore a dress that managed to be both elegant and practical, and David looked at her with the same mixture of respect and love that Tessa had learned to recognize in Mason's eyes. "Another partnership begins," Mason said as they watched Sarah and David exchange vows under an arbor decorated with wildflowers. "The best kind," Tessa agreed, "built on mutual respect and shared goals. They'll do well together." Sarah and David moved to Montana after the wedding, where they planned to establish their own breeding program using stock purchased from the Irving Granger Ranch and their own innovations. It was hard watching her daughter leave, but Tessa understood the need to build something of your own, to step out from your parents' shadow and prove your capabilities independently. Matthew and Rachel had given them 2 grandchildren by then, a boy named James and a girl named Elizabeth, and Rachel was pregnant with their 3rd child. The ranch house had been expanded twice to accommodate the growing family, and there was constant activity, constant noise, constant life flowing through the property. In 1908, Mason's 60th birthday arrived, and Tessa threw him a party despite his protests. The celebration brought together 3 decades of friends, workers, and business associates, all gathering to honor a man who'd built something remarkable through patience, skill, and integrity. Tessa stood to give a toast and found herself looking around at everything they'd created together. 30 years ago, she said, I met a man who told me he needed a partner with strength. I was 23 and angry at a world that kept telling me I was too independent for marriage, too strong-willed to make a good wife. Mason Irving proved that the problem wasn't me. The problem was that I'd been talking to the wrong people. He saw my independence as an asset, my strength as something to build beside rather than something to diminish. Together, we've created a ranch that's respected throughout the West, a breeding program that's changed how people think about working horses, and a family that I'm proud of every single day. So here's to Mason Irving, who had the wisdom to want a partner instead of a follower, and the courage to build something extraordinary with me. The gathered crowd cheered, and Mason pulled her close for a kiss that drew whistles and applause. Later, when the party had wound down and they sat together on the porch watching the stars, Mason said, "You know, when I first saw you in Placerville that day, arguing with Mrs. Henderson about improper attire, I thought you were the most magnificent thing I'd ever seen. Fierce and proud and completely yourself. I knew in that moment I wanted to know you to understand what made you who you were. And when I first saw you, I thought here's someone who actually sees me instead of just seeing a problem to fix or a woman to manage," Tessa said. "I didn't know then that I was meeting the person I'd spend my life with, but I knew you were different from anyone I'd met before." "We've had a good life," Mason said, "better than I ever imagined possible." "We're not done yet," Tessa pointed out. "We've still got years ahead of us, more grandchildren to meet, more horses to breed, more adventures to have." They did have years ahead of them. Years of watching Matthew and Rachel expand their part of the ranch operation. Years of letters from Sarah chronicling her and David's successes in Montana. Years of grandchildren growing up running through the property learning the same lessons Tessa and Mason had taught their own children. The ranch continued to prosper, adapting to changing times while maintaining the core values they'd built it on: hard work, integrity, and respect for both people and animals. In 1915, the world was changing dramatically. War raged in Europe. Automobiles were replacing horses in cities, and the last vestiges of the Old West were fading into history. Placerville had grown from a rough gold rush town into a proper city with electric lights and paved streets. The ranch had survived and thrived through economic panics, droughts, hard winters, and changing markets, testament to the solid foundation Tessa and Mason had established. They were both in their 60s now, slowing down more than either wanted to admit, but still active and engaged. Matthew handled most of the day-to-day operations, but Tessa and Mason remained involved in major decisions and spent hours each week working with the horses. For Mason especially, working with the animals was as natural as breathing, and he claimed he'd keep doing it until they carried him out of the stable. One spring evening in 1918, Tessa and Mason sat on the porch, watching the sun set over hills they'd worked for 40 years. They were both tired from a long day, but it was the good tired of meaningful work completed. Their grandchildren were playing in the yard under Rachel's watchful eye, and the sounds of their laughter drifted up to the porch. "You have any regrets?" Tessa asked suddenly. "Things you wish you'd done differently?" Mason was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. "None that matter," he said finally. "We made mistakes along the way, certainly. Times we pushed too hard or didn't push hard enough. But the big decisions, the important choices, I wouldn't change any of them. I chose you and you chose me, and together we built this. That's more than most people get in a lifetime." "I used to be so angry," Tessa said. "Angry at people telling me what I should be. Angry at the limitations placed on me because of my gender. I spent years fighting against those expectations. But somewhere along the way, I stopped fighting and started just living. Building what I wanted rather than defending against what others thought I should want." "That's because you found your partner," Mason said. "Someone to build with instead of against made all the difference." "You made all the difference," Tessa corrected. "You saw me as a whole person, not just a woman who needed to be managed or fixed. You wanted a partner with strength, and you respected that strength instead of trying to diminish it. That's rare, Mason. Even now, even with all the changes in the world, that's still rare." "Then we were lucky to find each other," Mason said. "Out of all the places we could have been, all the timing that could have been different, somehow we were both in Placerville that September day in 1878, and you were arguing with Mrs. Henderson about your riding clothes." Tessa laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "Poor Mrs. Henderson. I wonder if she ever understood that her disapproval pushed me toward you instead of away from independence. If she just left me alone, I might never have been so clearly ready to meet someone who valued exactly what she criticized." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear, and Tessa felt a deep contentment settle over her. She'd lived the life she'd wanted, achieved goals she'd set when most people told her they were impossible, and found love with someone who made her stronger rather than weaker. Their partnership had proven that strength matched with strength created something extraordinary, something that lasted not just years but decades. The ranch would continue long after they were gone, she knew. Matthew and Rachel would pass it to their children, and Sarah's operations in Montana were already being prepared to transfer to the next generation. The Irving Granger legacy would live on in the horses they'd bred, the methods they'd pioneered, and the example they'd set of what true partnership could achieve. But more than that, they'd proven that independence and partnership weren't opposing forces. A woman could be strong and capable and still choose to build a life with someone. A man could respect and support a woman's strength without diminishing his own. Together, they'd shown that the best partnerships were built on equality, respect, and the courage to defy expectations. As Tessa reached over and took Mason's hand in the growing darkness, she thought about that younger version of herself, the woman who'd been told she was too independent for marriage. She wished she could go back and tell that woman what was waiting in her future. Tell her that the right partner wouldn't want her to be less independent, less strong, less herself. The right partner would say exactly what Mason Irving had said all those years ago. "I need a partner with strength." And together, they'd built something beautiful.